for those who have joined already, and more will join eventually. This is the official start of our monthly forest restoration talks. As many of you might already know, it's a monthly series organized jointly by the Superb project, and the IUFRO task force called Transforming Forest Landscape for Future Climates and Human Well-Being. And together we investigate forest restoration questions from diverse perspectives, including scientific perspectives, of course, but also sometimes more practical, more policy perspectives, both from a global, both looking at the global and at the European level. And today we will focus on soil protection, with a focus on the EU. And we have two speakers, which I will introduce in more detail later. But just to let you know now, we have Karen Vankampenhout and Rainer Baritz. And now I would like to introduce you to the rules of the webinar. Next slide, please. As you already know and have been informed, the webinar is being recorded, and later on we will provide the webinar online on the EFI YouTube account and on the IUFRO website. We really want this webinar to be interactive, so please, as soon as a question or a comment comes to your mind, put it in the dedicated Q&A box, and then after the presentation, we will have a very urgent question after the first presentation, and then we would like to go after the second presentation into more of a panel discussion and invite then you as participants to contribute to that. And you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and if you want to join the panel, then please accept when we promote you to speakers, so you can ask a question live. This makes it a little more engaging. And in case you want to tweet about the webinar or X about the webinar, please tag us using IUFRO and Superb project. Usually no one is tweeting, but I'm still saying it because sometimes it can happen. And it's also fine if you just focus on listening, because that's the most important part. And now I'm happy to introduce the first speaker for today. Karen Vankampenhout is a professor of soil science at KU Leuven. She's focusing her research on soil organic matter, soil formation processes, and also the interaction between soil biota and soil carbon geochemistry. And of course, in general, the sustainable use of natural resources. And I can say from a personal perspective that she is the one who got me really excited about soil science. So I hope the same happens to you when you listen and you're not a soil expert yet, but maybe you want to follow up later on with Karen then afterwards. And now I'm happy to hand over to you, Karen, yeah, get everyone excited about soil science.
Okay, thank you, Keisha. I hope everybody can hear me and you can see my screen. Thank you for the great introduction. I hope your expectations are not too high. Now, whoops, well, I have the same problem. Just a minute. I'm gonna turn this thing down and then try to show my slides. I cannot see you anymore while I share my slides. So if there's anything wrong, please interrupt me. So today we're gonna talk a bit about soil health. And maybe I can start by introducing my nickname and some other people who are in this project that you may know. And they sometimes call us the last pedologists in the woods. We are the ones digging pits and everything. And there aren't that many people who are looking at different soils across landscape in different contexts and so on. Looking at soil pits and augurings and everything, it's considered a bit old-fashioned. So according a little bit like the last child in the woods, we may be the last pedologist in the woods. But I hope after today, we will be a little bit more if I can convince some of you. So the whole point, of course, of this webinar is that there is a big movement in the EU about soil health, and there's a big law on monitoring or in preparation on monitoring and what we should do to get our soil health back in business. I'm not going to talk about that. That I leave to the capable hands of our second speaker. I'm going to take you a little bit of a step back. Because soil health, a lot of people talk about it, but me, myself, for instance, I'm not sure I know what it is. And that's why I want to take you back to this presentation. It's the dimensions of this publication, I'm sorry, the dimensions of soil security. This is a concept developed by mainly Australian colleagues. It's also put into policy there. And this has 5 C's, if you like, that should be addressed if you want to have a secure soil, like a soil that is safe, a soil that can last into the future. The first one is capability. Then there's condition. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. There's connectivity. I'm also going to talk about that. And codification, I'm not going to talk about that. That's about laws and stuff. So you're going to hear about it later. And then capital, that's more the economical part. It's like monetary terms put in on resources. So the soil as a natural resources and what that is actually worth. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to start not with soil health, but with soil connectivity and why it is important. Because you may have seen infographics like this. This is basically all the things that soils do for the global sustainability goals. I'll summarize. Take care of your food, your health, your water, the air quality, the climate, everything. So soils are central to all these elements. So that should be pretty easy to sell, you would think. Another way of presenting it, it's soil function. So what do soil do for us? Again, producing our food, cycling nutrients, reducing greenhouse gases or buffering them, buffering water supplies, purifying them, providing us with important chemicals. Even soils have a great impact on our moods, on our own microbiomes and health, heritage, so many things that you would say this should be easy. A lot of people should care about soils, but often I get the impression that I'm preaching to the choir because soils are way less present, I would say, in debates compared to, for instance, species or biology or even dinosaurs, I think, are more popular than soils. So we're doing something wrong. And that's exactly the first part. If people don't know about it, if people don't talk about it, then soils can never be secure because it will never be somebody's priority. And where I think this went wrong is that the fact soils used to be part of a sort of informal knowledge. Everybody was growing their own food until, let's say, 100 years ago, something like that in Europe. So everybody knew a bit about soil. It was never part of formal training. It didn't need to be. But somehow we started buying our foods in supermarkets. We started living in cities and we lost the connection of the soil. That's why this connectivity word was put there. And it's really difficult to get that back. Why is that the case? These are a few quotes that people told me in big important congresses. I didn't put the names of the people who said that, but it goes along the lines as soil science, it's difficult, it's boring, the general public doesn't get it, so we should dumb it down, maybe. Well, the boring part I don't agree, but the difficult part I also do not agree. These are my kids during Corona. I'm not good in arithmetics, and they say homeschool your kids, so that's what I did. And I must say, even before that, I think when my son was 2.5, he could distinguish at least 4 different soil types, so it's not that hard. A child can do some of it, at least. The problem, I think, is that most people think this is what soils look like. And this is also what the internet thinks soils looks like. It's a bit of a brown, very generic thing. Apparently, it needs holding. I don't know why exactly. There's a sad little basil plant to liven things up a little bit. So who would think this is important? It seems to be brown and it seems to be everywhere. Even if we make infographics, we also sustain that image of a very boring brown thing that seems to be everywhere. So why should we bother with it? And that's my first point. We should stop doing that. We should. This is what soils actually look like. And this is just a catena from a plateau into a valley and then back up the plateau again. And on the right side, you see some beautiful forest profiles. You don't need 15 years in soils experience like me to see that these are all very different things. Different thing will happen in these soils, different things will grow on them, and so on and so forth. This is maybe 10 kilometers variation. So if in a European context, people are talking about big pedoclimatic zones that cover entire countries and even sometimes more than one country, you see my problem with that, I hope. There's all this variation, there are all these different soil types that we need to consider because they do very different things in landscapes. This is the same for a sandy area. This is something that was presented in a magazine, so in the centerfold actually. So under heathland, under farming, in valleys, under land dunes, you can see so many different soils. They're not generic at all. And each and every one of these soils has different advantages and disadvantages, or things they're good at and things they're not so good at. So it's really important to start recognizing these as challenges, but also as opportunities to manage better our land, but also to do better restoration. If you want to see some more nice pictures of soil, we put them, and to read about these challenges, we put them together at our website that you can see at the bottom of my screen. Even if we make movies about soil, we don't show soil at all. These are the posters of 2 recent movies about soil. The left one looks like, I don't know, a weird kind of cracked clay and with a flower. And the other one is a picture of a tree. It's just the entire tree rather than only the top. So we seem very reluctant to really talk about our topic and really allow other people even to enjoy at least the natural beauty of it. And that's my point exactly then. Like, who is going to love this big brown blob? We really have to stop doing that. We really have to stop thinking that soil is a generic thing. We have to start teaching people about soil again, but actually not also underestimating the people that they are too stupid to understand this, but also not reducing the soil to this really boring thing. Another element is that in a lot of ecological publications, for instance, you read about soil as the abiotic factor. Also, that is a big misconception, of course, with a lot of very bad consequences. For instance, here you see some beautiful roots of trees, and you see like they can have entire below ground strategies on how they colonize, how they get their resources, how they collaborate with other organisms, chemical warfare, the whole lot is happening beneath the surface. So if we think about trees, we should not just consider the top half or the top 2/3 maybe, but also what's going on underneath. And in terms of life, let's say, this is a picture of a grassland soil. According to a colleague of mine, it had about 15 dandelions and 7 other species, but the same or a similar soil would typically have 500 meters of plant roots, 5,000 arthropods, 10,000 nematodes, 100,000 protozoa, 50 kilometers of fungal hyphae, and over 100 billion bacteria. So most of the biodiversity is in the soil, so it's definitely not the abiotic factor, I would say. Some of this one you will probably know as a favorite of many people in the Superb project, the earthworms, but you also have mites, for instance. Here are a few. Some of them are really fierce predators. Other ones are a little bit more relaxed. They eat plants. Here is one of a favorite group of mine called they are springtails. So if you and they call like that because if you would bump where their tail should be. With a pin set or something, they can jump really, really far. But they also look very cute. There are many different species of this group. And you also, of course, have the microorganisms like this one. This is a fungus. You have the bacteria and so on. And we call these microorganisms. But this one, for instance, it's a species of Armillaria, I'm sorry, that lives in the United States, and this is one of the biggest organisms on the planet. It's about 10 square kilometers big. It's thousands of years old. Of course, most of it is under the ground in this very big mycelia and this very big webs of fungal hyphae. And that's really an important part. If we don't understand that this is a habitat, a self-structured habitat that takes decades and even millions of, thousands of years to form, we will go about it in a very unrespectful way, you could say. For instance, this is a picture I took of a forest conversion in Flanders. Here we are supposed to do restoration. You see this Corsican pine stand. This should turn into a much more biodiverse forest. And what do they do? Of course, they cut the pine, but they also remove the litter layer, and they want to get rid of the roots of the pine. So they rip them out, and the whole field is deep plowed. It looks a bit like this. Again, you don't need 15 years of experience in soil science to see that this is a very different story. So what is the original soil would have looked something like what you see on the left, and the soil after the so-called restoration measure, it looks like something that's now on the right. I have a lot of discussions with restoration people about this. Also, for instance, I heard about the demo in France, that there are places where if they do big pine plantations, they deep plow the soil, they add a lot of things, but basically you're making an arable field with a woody crop on top. Why this self-organization is so important, you can understand if you think about your house. It has a table, it has your bed, it has a kitchen probably with some spoons and some knives in it, but it also has a structure. If I would blow up your house and tell you to live in it, even though your bed is still there somewhere, and your knives and your forks and your kitchen is also somewhere in the rubble, it's no longer possible to live in it. It's a little bit the same for these soil organisms and even plant roots. They're not evenly distributed over these profiles. They have specific strategies, they have specific niches in that soil, and if you just in a few hours rip the whole thing apart, it takes a very long time. Even it's not conceivable in a human lifetime to restore these micro niches, this habitat underground. So you could ask from a very fundamental point of view, if these things are ours to destroy, can we do that? It's like basically ripping apart something that took thousands of years to form. But also it's not, it destroys a lot of the life and the functionality of the soil. For instance, this is a article by a colleague of mine that shows, for instance, these fungi. They're very big. They don't like to be ripped into small pieces, and it takes over 100 years to restore complex functions like processes of lignin decomposition in the soil, for instance, before they are reconnected again. So it's really important that we start looking at these soils as habitats, as really complex things, and also as things that can be very different from site to site, and to learn these different soil types. Because learning soil types is like naming soils, if you want. It's a bit out of fashion, and people would like to go, yeah, can we not just measure the texture and how much water there is, and forget about all these pits and augurings and soil maps and so on? I think it's a bit of a mistake, and I'll show you why. If you would just look at soil moisture and soil texture, which is a typical thing most people would look at, these soils would all be the same. They are all dry, sandy soils. They even have comparable pHs, some of them. and maybe even in the topsoil the same or a comparable organic matter content. But even an idiot can see that these are not the same soils again. And also if you would plant, for instance, a pine on it, it in maybe 100 years on some of these soils, it would be maybe 10, 15 meters, and on other it can be maybe 30 or even 40. So it's not enough just to stick to a few parameters. You really have to make the effort and try to understand the different soil types. Same for a loam. For instance, these are both well-drained loams, sorry for the Dutch, and they don't look much the same. I cannot point to my slide, but you will see on the right pictures, there are some weird white streaks in it. This will not appear if you just look at a few properties. It's called what we call a phagic horizon. It's a remnant of the ice age, but the effect of this horizon becomes very clear after a storm. For instance, beaches, they become very prone to wind throw if you don't manage for this soil type. So this can be a very expensive mistake if you forget about these soil horizons. Yeah, so how can you learn about soils? It's actually very easy. Almost every country has soil maps. Flanders has and Belgium has a really extensive one. They did 5 million observations and they dug 11,000 pits for it. And a lot of people now just completely ignore that effort. So that's rude to say the least. But also there's a very beautiful document of the GRC, even the Soil Atlas of Europe, that explains all these things in a very easy way, and it has some coarse scale maps of soils of Europe. So if you think these 5 million augurings are a bit much, you can start with this beautiful atlas. You can download it for free, and you can start learning about the different soil types of Europe and why they are important. It's all there. You just have to download it. Soil types are also important because they determine what our land can supply. Because different soils are good at different things. Some, for instance, these are the landmark projects, some are really good in sequestering carbon, other ones are really good arable soils, other only produce grass very well, some are really important for buffering water. And you see it's not the same for every soil. So if you know about your soils and if you know what their challenges and opportunity are, it's much easier to get the landscape functioning. This is, for instance, what we did for a forest in Flanders. Not going to go into detail, but the red points on the map on the left are places where it's much easier to store a lot of carbon. And if you look at the soil map on the right, you'll see that also there the soil map has a different color. So depending on the different soil types that are here in this very small forest, already you can, for the management, you can learn a lot about where you should focus on carbon sequestration and where the same effort will not give you a lot of additional benefit. The important thing about soil types is also when we start looking at this monitoring law, that we have to make the difference, and then we come to the two other C's about capability and condition. What I was telling you about is capability. A soil type can do some things very well and others a little bit less, and it depends on what function you want. The soil has a different capability. So you should look at every soil type separately for that. But apart from that, there's also a condition. It's the state that the soil is in. It depends on land use, but also land management. So it's a degradation parameter, and capability and condition together, they will determine performance for different services, ecosystem functions that you want from your soil. So, and that's really important because in terms of politics, they would just like, okay, they like one number, right? We need so much organic carbon, we need so much earthworms or something. If possible, the same number for the entire European Union. That will be very convenient for politics, I understand, but it's not the reality. You need to assess this depending on soil type. It's a little bit like me. I'm not a very fast runner by birth, let's say, by genetics. But if I train very hard, I may beat somebody who was born with better running genes, but who sits on the couch all day. So what you are born with, let's say, is your capability, but what you train is your condition. It's a little bit the same with soils. You have to look at what is this soil inherent properties, and then how is it managed. And that's important because our world resources, they're not in very good shape. About 1/3 of our usable soil has been lost to erosion and surface sealing, and the health or the condition of most of the others is not very good. This happened before and it ended in tears. So just let me give, and the big problem is that soils have tipping points. So they look really okay for a really long time, even though they are losing their resilience. So if you just look at tree health or just look at yield, you will only find out about the problem when it's already too late to do something about it. An example from the Roman Empire, they are on a soil type called Leuvisols. It's the most productive, among the most productive soil type in the world. They could grow a very big civilization on it. But Leuvisols, if you don't control erosion, they will start eroding like mad. Like you can see here, all the badlands, all these dry landscapes that you see in North Africa and around the Mediterranean, they're all man-made. They were not like that before. They are badlands from Roman times. They've been in a very bad shape for 2000 years. They're not coming back again. And this in no small means was contributing to the fall of the West Roman Empire. And this continues in the 14th century. We have a very similar situation. This leads to, upon a few bad climatic years, this leads to plummeting of yields. Everybody gets sick. 20 to 50 million people died. Land degradation played a very big role in that. 20th century, the Great Plains, they used to be the breadbasket of the United States with the mollysols, but the problem is if you switch to arable crops with shallow rooting system, this is what happens in a dry year. The Dust Bowl is one of these things. 3.5 million people were displaced by land degradation. So it's something that we kind of don't want to happen. If you say, oh, this is a long time ago, but today, for instance, in Argentina, there are Solonchaks is again a type of soil type that's really vulnerable to salinization if you remove the tree cover. This is what happens. It happened before in Australia, and then you have a nice salt crust and nothing grows anymore. I think I see I didn't note the impact of it, but it's a loss of billions of euros in Australia alone to this dry land salinization problem. So I hope I convinced you we need to take capability into account, and we also need to look at condition, and that's what we need to monitor. And it's really important because it could bring a lot of problems if we don't. But also for forest restoration, it's really important to look at different soil types because, again, we have these context-dependent problems and opportunities. For instance, in another European project, Sub4ES, we are looking at indicators that are related to soil fauna. But for instance, this is a paper of Ellen that shows that there is a functionality of earthworms in the acidification of forest soils, but not all the time, only in certain conditions, in certain soil types. So this feedback loop, if you want, is there one time and the other not. So it's really important, again, to know the soil context. Same thing with exotic species. This Prunus nigra, it has a reputation of stealing nutrients, especially phosphorus from other trees. That's true in some conditions, but not in others. In others, it even helps other tree species get their calcium magnesium balances back in check. So it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. It depends on the soil type. Yeah, that's the same thing. You may have seen this. It's a new fashion, let's say, of fighting acidification, if improving the soil with this rock dust. And for instance, this is one of our papers that shows that it works in some cases, but definitely not all. Here you see two sides, and let's say the steeper this line is, the better the trees grow. And on side one, the control is in the top. So that's the dark purple one with the dots. And there you see that most of the treatments are exactly the same as the control. Only one is a little bit better, and some are even worse than the ones that did not receive any rock dust. If you look at the other side, side two, then you see the control treatment again on the upper left. It's not doing well at all, but if you add some, but also not all of these rock dusts, the situation does improve. So you can spare yourself a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of money if you know on which soil this is going to work and on which soil this is not going to work. And the last part, and then I stop talking because I think I filled my time. That's if we are thinking about monitoring, if we are thinking about indicators, they need to be scalable. Because all these lab tests, all these methods, counting all this fauna, it's extremely expensive. So it's never going to work on a big scale. So some things that we are trying in our lab that you can see a few images of is trying to see if we can, the things we have to monitor. So we have to monitor condition. If we can cut a few corners, if we can make this cheaper, faster, more field driven. So we hope to get back to you on that in a few years with some solutions. So my take home messages are death to the boring brown blob. Never, ever, ever do that again to depict the soil as a really sad brown thingy. Or as an abiotic resource. And you can start learning about soils and soils type today. A child can do it. You can start, for instance, with this atlas and just admire a few pretty pictures if you like. There are a lot of other atlases in that series, so just browse through it and you can already start learning. And quite a lot of these things are not so difficult, are not so expensive. So it's a really nice thing to start learning about if you don't know about it yet. Remember, there's a difference between capability and condition. Capability relates to soil type. It should be acknowledged. It should be mapped. And condition is the one that should be monitored. But what is a good carbon content will again depend on capability and on land use, for instance. Soil health can be relative to land use. It's not always the case, but you also have to take that into account. And then apart from this whole soil health thing, also for other restoration issues, soil types are really important because restoration measures and successes will depend on capability and condition, and also indicators that we use. And the latter one should be scalable, so they're not too expensive and too difficult to use. So, very warm welcome to the dark side. I hope next time you're in a forest, you will think a little bit about all the organisms, all the roots, and all the beauty that is below your feet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I think the participants have figured out now why I got so excited about soil. So thank you for the overview, but also to kind of refer to the different aspects of the soil and how it can be monitored. And I have a couple of follow-up questions, but I'm just wondering if there's any question in the Q&A yet. Because if not, I would suggest that we continue with Rainer's presentation and I come up with a follow-up question, and I'm sure Andreas also has some, and then maybe also more from the participants after the second presentation, so that we have a kind of complementary overview. So I would like to introduce our second speaker for today now, Dr. Rainer Baritz. He's the coordinator of the European National Reference Centers Soil at the European Environment Agency, the EEA. And obviously, he's also a researcher, and his research interests are in European soil condition assessment, You mentioned the condition already, Karen, so we'll probably follow up on that as well. Chemicals in soils, and also soils and climate change. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, Rainer. You have the floor.
Great, Geisha. Thanks for the introduction. And welcome, everybody. I suppose you see my presentation now also in presentation mode?
No, it's not in presentation mode. We can see
it is on my screen.
Yeah, it's always the issue with Zoom.
Then I try that without getting too confused. No,
yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Kind of like that?
Yes, okay. You can go with that. That's okay.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation again. And I expect that I'm talking to forest researcher, forest monitoring experts, indicator experts. So something that I would associate with IUFRO. I'm not so familiar with the superb project though, but I'm happy to speak about European soil protection, in particular related to forest soils also. And just a quick introduction, I'm from the European Environment Agency, and what we do is we report about the status of the environment in Europe. We support the European Commission on various environmental policy aspects. You could summarize our work as operating in the science policy interface, and I show you here a report. Recently, we have published a report on soil monitoring and regarding what healthy soil, the question what healthy soils really are. You probably find some helpful advice in that report, maybe not the answer, but at least some advice. I would present a little bit, just a very short overview of aspects really regarding the soil monitoring law, and then I would create some links to forest soils. Here you can see an overview, maybe to introduce this law. This law has been published in the context of the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030, and it has foreseen to develop a new updated soil strategy, which is then the 2022 EU Soil Strategy 2030, and foresaw a proposal for a legislative framework. And then you see here now, published last year, a proposal for a directive. And this fits into a, let's say, series of initiatives that impact soil or soil protection quite intensively. There is the nature restoration law in discussion. It's not approved yet in the European Council, but it's still in heavy debate. There is also a forest law in discussion, and here we have a soil monitoring law in discussion. You could even add into the nice policy framework of soil protection, the zero pollution action framework, the chemical strategy, but also the farm to fork strategy, which foresees the reduction of pesticides and also fertilizers, mineral fertilizers. So there are various policy initiatives that tackle aspects of soil protection from different angles. And this soil monitoring law has a very specific focus, of course, on soils, with building blocks. And the building block, besides monitoring, is sustainable soil management, which in principle would be restoration practices, which connects to the name of your webinar, and has two additional related building blocks. One is on land monitoring, and that is closely connected to this notion of no net land take, which you're probably also familiar with, but not directly, but at least indirectly through monitoring. And it also focuses on contaminated sites. So what you see here in yellow, these are the main aspects of the law. And then also important to say there are annexes, and these annexes contain various parameters and methodologies for monitoring. I make this a little bit smaller, there you see it. So the objective of this legislative proposal is to put in place a monitoring framework and have a non-binding policy target, policy objective, which is to achieve healthy soils by 2015. Why is that urgent? We just heard from Karen various reasons why soil protection is important. Karen gave you some global examples for the European soils. We have this, let's say, rough orientation from monitoring that 60 to 70% of our soils are not healthy, are degraded. And if you just focus on agricultural soils, then probably the proportion is even higher. Whereas it's a bit unclear to which extent this is degradation on the basis of current management. So it's important to discuss soil protection also in the eyes of practitioners, and they may say that they manage soils with sustainable practices, while the monitoring indicates or measurements indicates that the soils are not in a good state. So we do have a situation where we have an inheritance also of historic degradation, which all comes into play when we receive estimates of current soil degradation in Europe like that. Soil health is defined as the physical, chemical, biological condition determine its capacity to function. And Karen just referred to the terminology using condition and capability. In a certain way, you find this also in the discussion of soil health, whereas the difficulty with condition and capability is that we observe soils as they are now. We often don't know their real capability. And so healthy is in principle a soil that stays within ecological or within, let's say, safe limits, within a expected threshold where we know that ecosystem services that soils fulfill are not negatively impacted beyond a level of expectancy, so to say. So we do look at the condition, but condition capability as we measure it is very much mixed. So thresholds, and in the proposed law calls it criteria, is the aid, the entrance, allowing us to determine which soil is healthy and which soil is not healthy. So that's the basic idea, and it's a bit copied from the pollution-based risk assessment, that you want to ensure that soil fulfills certain functions, and you develop these criteria in order to know whether a specific soil fulfills it or doesn't. So then some aspects in the soil, I'll do that very briefly. I don't go very deep. Member states set up methods to select sampling points, and they can use also the existing systems, of course, but there will be very likely enhanced representativity criteria that challenge current monitoring systems. The proposed law suggests reference methods, and if for some reason a country deviates from this reference method because there is an established national method, then conversions are needed to get an idea of what the results is in a European context and comparability. Then I mentioned already the criteria, guidance values to detect soil degradation levels. This is really the key. And I would hypothesize now that you don't find that in current existing monitoring systems, where ecological thresholds are not established or are needed so that we have an idea of what we actually measure. The very conventional thought is, yes, you compare it with capability, you compare your current state with a natural state. I mean, that challenges or even forest monitoring experts, because even under forest, you will hardly find soils under undisturbed natural conditions in Europe. The same with forest vegetation. And then countries will be asked to develop soil health assessments and report on it in a certain interval, at least 5 years. It's currently in discussion. And they report on trend and on impact on ecosystem services. So it's not just only I measure soil carbon and nitrogen. I also need to understand to which extent the measurements that I'm taking impact on different ecosystem services, the water regime, the nutrient regime, the carbon cycling, and so on. And interesting aspects also for those of you who discuss at the moment the proposed forest law is the idea of soil districts, or homogeneous spatial units that have a comparison, that may have comparable conditions and then also require comparable management conditions for restoration. And so these soil districts are established in this legislative proposal, are more or less based on administrative entities. The member states would appoint competent authorities for each district, and also the member states monitor soil health through so-called soil descriptors, indicators for each soil district. What is probably more of interest for you is what is recommended regarding restoration. And here the proposed law asks member states to identify measures to tackle unhealthy soil. So which measures would be restorative if you are faced with carbon degradation or nitrogen surplus, or metal pollution, exceedance of critical metal limits. So when you have the situation, what's the best practice that would be site adapted and that would have a restorative impact? So what the law here foresees is that the countries define these measures, but they are presented an annex with so-called sustainable soil management principles. So avoid bare soil, minimize physical soil disturbance, adapt machinery to soil conditions, and so on. So you find, let's say, more generic principles targeted to establish sustainable soil management at member state level. And then member states will be asked to implement this gradually on all managed soils over a temporal process where there is no specific time limit given. So that would be a bit of an overview of this legislative proposal, and just a few more aspects on forest soil monitoring. When I looked up the condition of forests, and I would say that will impact also then soils. The vegetation and soil interface is very tight. Then you will see that a large proportion, forests in generally are considered semi-natural. So from a soil point of view, would say, yeah, okay, then it's not a big problem maybe regarding the soils under these forests, which are semi-natural, no? And but then when you look a little bit deeper, then you will find statistics that only 27% of these forests are uneven aged. So that's a good sign, but 30% have only one tree species. And we all know how single tree species management affects also soils and soil condition. The question is whether this is measurable in a way that the condition of forest soils is impacted to a level where critical ecological limits would be exceeded. Big question. So then a step further, how is the ecosystem forest, how is the EU European forest condition described? When we look into the latest ecosystem service mapping exercise that has been done on the European level in 2020, and there you would see that 47% of the forest land is exposed to several drivers of degradation. So from that point of view, you may expect that monitoring will also yield some quantitative information to how these drivers of degradation impact then also forest soils, but we don't have much information about it when you really look into monitoring results. But that would be then the question. The conservation status of forest habitats, as we receive this information reported from member states through the nature directives, count 53 or almost 54% in poor status. We don't know much about it. These are the figures that we receive by forest habitat, and these are alarmingly high figures. And despite maybe some positive trends like increasing stocks, increasing area through afforestation, that has an impact then also on forest soils. But how is that impact? How are the forest soils really doing? This is an exercise that I've been doing in preparation of our status and outlook report in 2020. I wanted to see in which which condition and trend certain processes for forests are that are usually also monitored through existing indicators. So potentially indicators could teach us exactly which arrow is going in which direction and how that impacts soil, but it's not the case. You will not find that. The current indicators that I'm aware of, like from Forest Europe, for example, they are not at that level of detail that you have reliable information on the trend of these indicators, and not even talking about soil condition. So this is basically not existent, and you could not make a reliable conclusion about the state of forests when you look at these indicators. Forest topsoils is something that I would like to present to you, supplementing the slides just presented by Karen. The forest topsoils are, from a biodiversity point of view, but also from a water management and nutrient management point of view, super important. They're very fragile. They can very easily be disturbed and destroyed, and we don't really know how easily they are restored in their original functioning, or whether in a new forest generation you will have a forest floor development, but it does not have the ecological quality of the initial naturally developed forest floor as you had it before some forest management practice. And when you look at the high proportion of single species forests, we know how they are established, then you pretty much know that the forest floor is completely destroyed. So what's the impact of that? We don't know much about that either. This is just re-emphasizing the importance of the forest floor and soil habitat for biodiversity. There are some general numbers and indications known, but again, I would say from what I found in literature, forest soil specific monitoring is urgently needed. Questions? And then I'm almost finished. So what is actually forest soil degradation? I would, if such a large proportion, I mean, if forests are considered semi-natural compared to other natural ecosystems in Europe, then probably the level of forest degradation is fairly low. But then when I see how certain forest operations impact soils, when I look around the area where I live, even in very hilly areas, the degree of mechanization in forest harvesting is enormous. And the destruction after a winter of operation is heavy. But is that to a level where we can say that the ecological functioning of soils are compromised? We don't know that. Do we actually have criteria that help us to assess in which condition a soil is in relation to the ecosystem services expected from that soil? And what is the knowledge base that we will receive then from forest soil monitoring as it exists, or to be expected once the once the soil law, the soil protection law that I was just introducing you to, would become into action. I have a few more conclusions, and they are a bit more positive, because forest monitoring has really a long tradition. And what we know in Europe from forest soil monitoring through the ICB Forest is really substantial on comparability, on systematic errors, on representativity. you could still conclude that there are gaps exist for relationships between soil and biodiversity, between the structure of forest and forest floors and various soil-related indicators. Yes, these gaps are definitely existing, and the soil law offers an opportunity to dig deep into the status of soils and how we can manage them in a more sustainable or even restorative manner. I have a few more conclusions, but I would like to keep it now because it's 3 to 5, and maybe there is an opportunity for a couple of questions before the webinar closes. So thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me, and I hope I contributed to a few knowledge gaps that maybe some of you have regarding the soil law and forest soils in this science policy context. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rainer, for this overview. And I think the presentations were really complementary. So that was really cool. We would like to continue with the panel now. And we have some questions from the audience. However, before we start, I know that Andreas has some urgent questions also to discuss. So you can start, and then we will involve the audience as well with questions.
Yes, thank you, Gesche, and thank you also to you, Karen and Rainer, for this really inspiring talks and presentations. One question is a bit a general question concerning the term soil health, because we have also the discussion about forest health, but according to my understanding, health is always related to the level of organisms. An organism can be healthy or unhealthy, but I struggle a bit by transferring it to a system, to a bio or ecosystem like soils and forests, because I don't think that a soil can be healthy or unhealthy. So what is the unhealthy law? It can be degraded. And I think this idea of, or this term degradation, we have also in forest landscape restoration, but we are not restoring unhealthy landscapes. So for me, it's in a certain, I have really problems with it. I think it's also misleading. So I have also the impression that the change of the term from soil health law to soil monitoring law is also perhaps trying to reflect this concern. So what is your opinion about this?
Okay, shall I go first, or?
If you like, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, you're perfectly right. That's also what I'm saying, like what is exactly soil health? And that's also why I want to have people think about it. We've called these things many times before. We spoke about soil quality, but that was too too much thinking of agronomy and so on and so forth. So it's basically having the understanding, like Rainer said, that a soil that has if you see like this degradation sequence where this person I showed was in the middle of his chair, so if he will not fall off even if you give him a little push, and then the soil will go less and less resilient, and then all of a sudden it will really collapse. You have these tipping points that I tried to show, where the soil no longer can perform its function. It starts becoming something completely else, very salty, highly eroded, no more organic matter, starts blowing away all these kind of stuff. That's a bad soil. That's a dead soil, you can say. That's the end of the line. But the thing with soil health is that most people understand it better because it strikes a more familiar nerve than soil quality. So it did a lot of good changing the name to soil health because all of a sudden there was more connectivity. But I agree, it's a difficult concept to define really well.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Not much to add. I mean, sometimes we have maybe a more academic discussion about terminology. The impact of choosing soil health was a positive one, and the association is the correct is a correct one. It's about soil protection. It's about soil function and ecosystem services from soils. So there is nothing that would limit the utilization of the term. But from a content side, soil is by no means, let's say, an unorganic mechanism. It is actually an ecosystem that is alive and has many inhabitants that need to be fed, and they need to have an environment to flourish. So that pretty much all processes, or large amount of processes, are biochemically mediated. No? And so we have, in fact, a biological organism. And it's a very complex one, which we don't really fully understand when you just imagine that more than 90% of the species that we actually have in the soil are not even identified yet. No? So we're talking about a biological system, or biomineral system, or biogeochemical system, however you want to talk it, and people are becoming aware. Just our measurements are limited. We look at it largely from a mechanical, physical point of view, and we lack knowledge on the biologically related indicators. That's for sure. We lack a lot of knowledge on the connections between different ecosystem compartments. So personally, I'm not disturbed by the term at all. I find it's a good solution, although I see where you come from when you talk about degradation, because in the background it's about degradation. No?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And from a communications perspective, I can only support that you need something that people can refer to, people who are not experts like you, for instance, policymakers, or also the broader public. It helps to find a terminology that a lot of people can actually relate to. There's a question from an anonymous participant, and then afterwards I will ask Koen live. He's a colleague from Superb. But starting with a question from the audience, I think it's a question to you, Rainer. What would you take out of the Australian approach to the EU, and how? I think the question means, like, what can we learn from the Australian approach?
I think the Australian approach was published a bit earlier, no? And it introduces a term, soil security. You can argue about new terms if the concepts are behind it are not that new. It's a bit holistic, going from a policy implementing level to an ecological level. I find for practitioners, even monitoring practitioners, the idea of the use of certain terms like land evaluation. This is a term coming from a different context, actually. And capability on condition, yes, we are aligned. So in this respect, recent report, our report, but also recent research from the European Joint Programming on Agricultural Soils, they came up with similar approaches. But like I explained before, this idea of capability on condition, when you look at monitoring results and you want to talk to practitioners and tell them, here, this is where you actually need to change something, and here, no, here's everything okay. That is really difficult when you look at monitoring results. So from an academic review and more or less holistic proposal into something that can be implemented, there are some steps. And this is something that we are developing now, and where the legislative proposal that I presented takes these elements on board. And this is really novel. This notion of criteria is sensational in a way, because it challenges monitoring and research to come up with ecological limits that are convincing also to users and practitioners.
Thanks, Rainer. And it's also really good that you have this knowledge on the legislation, and also not just what is happening in the EU, but also beyond, because I think this is like really enriching the discussion, and I'm getting a little excited about legislative texts now. So it's another excitement for today. Now I would like to ask Koen, my colleague from Superb, working for Landlife, because he also has a question. Please unmute yourself.
You can hear me now?
Yes, we can. And someone was typing, so maybe you stop the typing.
Okay, many thanks for two very nice presentations. Maybe to explain to Rainer, I did work for Landlife, so not in a research organization. And what we do is restoration, reforestation of degraded lands in Europe, but also globally. And we would also like to include the soil. And kind of the issue we face is if you start with a very degraded system, you would like to say, okay, where are we heading to? What is the reference? How to define the reference? How to set criteria for here we are now? We can characterize maybe conditions or capacities and so on. And there is where we are heading to. How to define that, both in terms of, let's say, soil biodiversity. We do. I'm not sure if Josephine is able to participate because it's very much her topic. We do eDNA and measurement, and we collect all sorts of biodiversity. And if we compare two places, you find lots of difference in biodiversity. What does it mean? Where are we heading to? How fast can we expect in diversity terms, but also in terms of soil organic matter? So what are the impacts if you reforest with a particular species, with a particular density? What can you see and expect, and how fast does it go? Mm-hmm. What would be your solution to such questions?
I can
yes,
maybe,
please.
yeah, it's for me. Yeah, we have quite a lot of research on that.
Okay.
So
mm-hmm.
Which tree species to use in which conditions, and there you see sometimes a tree species can topple from one type of soil functioning to the other. And again, there I would like to stress that we do know these criteria, more or less. We have these ecological limits, not in terms of species yet, but let's say for soil carbon, for organic soil, a peat soil, a histosoil, we call it, it can still be very high in carbon, but completely degraded. The upland soil that maybe 5 kilometers further can be much lower in carbon, but can be in excellent condition. Mm-hmm. So that's also what you can do with it. Like if you think about a harvesting operation in a valley soil or on an upland soil, if you put a very heavy tractor on an upland sand, it's fine. It will not damage too much. Do the same tractor, put it like 1 kilometer further on a different soil type, it will be a disaster. It will never recover. So that's really important. So I get the whole administration, I get the whole district thing, but soils don't work like that. There are limits, there are criteria, but they are soil type specific. And there has been a lot of work done in pedology. It's all a bit in the gray literature. It's mostly forgotten, but it is there. We just have to value what we know about soils, all this mapping and everything. It has been done in every single country, almost, not as intensive as the Belgian ones. But that's also important to realize. For instance, for our carbon, the latest carbon monitoring we have, and we have a very good soil map, and then we stopped because our best monitoring data are from the 50s, believe me or not, on soil carbon. But there you see that the best predictor for that carbon was the land use in the 18th century. So see, you have to take these things into account. They often also align with soil type. So how to find these criteria is to test them for different soils. And sometimes, for instance, if you have a very calcareous soil, you can put any tree on that you like. It will never acidify. Well, you will need 5,000 years before it acidifies. If you do that on a soil that's just on the balance between becoming acidic and non-acidic, if you then put a tree species with a very poor little quality, it will go down the drain very quickly. And the bad thing is that soils that are well buffered, they take a longer time to acidify, but once they're acid, they're much more difficult to get back. So understanding where the threshold is can really help focus efforts, focus money. Like, will this help? If you want to put, if you have a limited amount of money and time and effort to do a restoration measures, where should you do it? And then you need your maps. So that's what I like about the Australian approach. It combines maps that makes like the little squares, like where the thing is the same, that's already mapped, that is on a map. And then you set criteria for each and every unit that you have in the landscape. And that, I think, is from what I know about soils from a biochemical, physical point of view, is the only thing that has been proven to work before in the future. And I think it can work again. We don't have really an absolute reference. It's also not very fair to go back to a natural soil because, for instance, for carbon, if you want to produce food, an arable field will always have less carbon than a forest.
Yes. Yeah.
Is it degraded? Well, yeah, somewhat, yeah. But yeah, unless we learn how to eat water or air, we need to do something.
Yeah.
So it's there. The land use is also something that's got to give somewhat. But yeah, so that's my take on it, that we do have already a pretty good indication where most of the thresholds are, but it's in the old literature.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. If you have, let's say, because clearly in our case, and not being in research, and let's say people from our organization have to explain this to clients, then we need a justification. It is not that we can connect to an expert and then say, okay, this is the best knowledge available. We would need a kind of justification. Great literature, maybe if that is the best. So if you would have recommendation, maybe as a follow-up, I would be most interested in that. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Karen and Koen, I have a follow-up question. What do you think about the use of trees with nitrogen fixation? Because I think those trees are really, changing the soil chemistry. So think about black locust, but perhaps also others. On less fertile soils, it would more or less provide also benefits for establishing tree cover and so on, but might be, what do you think about the effects on soil chemistry?
Yeah.
Well, to my experience, if we can, we would always combine with nitrogen fixing species because quite a lot of our soils are really degraded. And if there is in the potential species pool nitrogen fixing species available, then we would do that. For instance, in Australia, that would be the acacia species, and another system it would be other species. Often our sites are not good enough for black lotus. But if it is available in the species spectrum that we can plant for that forest ecosystem, then we would always try to do that. So.
Maybe. Anybody else want? But what I would say, in Flanders and in the Netherlands, definitely not, because we're already soaked in nitrogen. It will not make a difference whatsoever. We have too much nitrogen. So that's another thing about the soil. You have to find the biggest problem and then restore that. That will give you the biggest yield. It's Liebig's barrel, if you like. It's an agronomical thing, but it also works for forest. If your forest has a nitrogen problem, then by all means introduce nitrogen fixing species. If your forests are soaked in nitrogen like ours, unfortunately there are no phosphorus fixing soils. But that would be a lot more useful in our case. Yeah.
And I think you also wanted to comment, and then we have further questions. So quite an active audience today.
Okay, then I'll make it very short, because regarding criteria, your question, Cohen, there regarding acidification, eutrophication, and nutrients, you have very well established criteria for forests. regarding indicators that connect to biology, it's more difficult. You can operate with vegetation in combination with humus types. There are really nice, more detailed description of humus types and how they degrade when you change species. So you have something like an expectation quality instrument in hands by using refined humus classifications. Regarding carbon, it's more difficult because most carbon assessments don't look sufficiently detailed to the forest floor. If you only characterize the mineral soil carbon storage in forest, you don't need to. No? The drainage regime plus the combination of the mineral soil and the forest floor, that would yield something. And there actually target values criteria are very site specific, and you cannot really generalize for larger areas. You really need to dig deep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
There's another question from the audience, which is which target would you set for a sustainable level of soil erosion? Like, for instance, in EU forest by soil type, for instance, and which erosion measures would you recommend or indicate?
Shall I go for it? Or Karen, do you want to?
Yeah, I have an idea, but you go first maybe this time.
No, you can go first.
Okay, well, erosion is one of these things, it's always bad. Nitrogen is good, but not too much and not too little. Erosion is always a bad thing because we're losing soil, right? And if it's human induced, is always bad. So zero erosion is always the best. What erosion measure you take also depends a bit on, it's quite a intricate science how to do this right. Because if you implement the wrong erosion control measure, you will make it a lot worse. That's the thing. A badly applied erosion control measure is really the worst thing you can do. In forests, it's quite easy because there is normally a quite high erosion, a high cover. There is a nice forest floor, really important. I totally agree. That already helps with the problem of erosion. Then there you should focus on the forest operations. Like we see massive erosion, for instance, if you have a big clear cut on a steep slope with a clay substrate, for instance, that will cause even landslides if you're not careful. So yeah, erosion is always, I would recommend zero if I can. That's maybe a bit ambitious, but still that's where we should have to go. And the measure is, it needs to be well thought of for sure.
And in principle, I agree. And the question and my answer now shows a bit of the challenge of a policy, because the policy and criteria imply that you have an allowable, an acceptable level of degradation. No? So from a scientific side, Karen, 100%.
Yeah.
Now comes the policy side. So what is allowable and what is beyond a critical limit where ecosystem services are compromised? This is exactly the challenge. And what we find in literature is a level of erosion around 2 tons. Let's say 1.8 ton is roughly, depends on the site and the climate and the physiogeographic condition, how much soil also redevelops. And so from that point of view, 1.8 ton seems sustainable. So 2 tons is established. And when you go into, for example, the Swiss legislation, they have refined this for deeply developed soils, especially close to water bodies. They have a different erosion. So for soils lower than 40 centimeters, they have a 2 ton limit. For soils larger than 40 or no 70 centimeters, they have 4 tons. No? And now with a legislative proposal where 2 tons were proposed, many countries are in opposition, and they have such high erosion values. It's mostly on agricultural land. So what do you have on forest land? I suspect maybe in some really rugged mountainous areas that you deforest maybe you have even landslides, you have catastrophic events, no? But on a normal zonal forest soil, you would probably not have more than this amount of erosion. And then the other aspect is to monitor it. Monitoring is another challenge, not because most results are modeling results, predictions over 100-year average. And so then these predictions yield higher erosion rates given the current climate and land use. It's maybe a bit complicated to explain, but there is a mismatch between real monitoring and actually model-based monitoring. So it's a measurement. It's a complicated issue, and here we don't talk about site-specific criteria, but more generic limit values, and this is where the 2-ton limit is currently in discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much for these explanations. And it's also very useful that you can wear both the researcher and the policy maker hat, Rainer. I think because I know we have some policymakers also in the webinar, so I'm quite sure they're curious to learn about that, because they're dealing with that with also the monitoring law on a regular basis. We have another participant of the webinar, Jerry Lawson, who has a question to either both of you or one of you. And maybe shortly introduce yourself, and then you can ask your question, Jerry. Okay, there's obviously a problem with the sound. We can't hear you. Yeah. I'm afraid I have to ask a question for you, but I will still show you in the camera and just ask the question for you so that people can see you. Okay, so the question was related to financial assistance that that farmers in many countries get to analyze their soils. To what extent are these field scale data recorded in national databases together with agreed metadata like the lab involved and geospatial location, for instance? And I would also be interested in the link to forests, because there's different legislation, I think, for farmers than for forest owners, unfortunately.
Well, that's an interesting question. So the soil law requires countries to publish, to make their soil health data public. So that means at least the progress reports on soil district levels will be public, and probably also some level of measurements, but that is not very clear yet because everything is still in negotiation. No? In an ideal form, there is another directive for the European Union members which asks them to publish with permanent access and online accessibility all monitoring data that they have that they are collecting. But this is not mandatory, and countries handle it very differently. There's an open data directive, and so there are various legislative frameworks in place that actually demand public access. In detail, when it comes to measurements and spatial locations at on private farms, no? Then there are limitations, and that is then very country specific. So I cannot really tell you exactly how this is going to be handled. The same way access of landowners and farmers to analysis. We have some examples in Europe where countries enable farmers to have free access to analysis. That is not always the case. The law wanted to stimulate this very successful example, but I cannot tell you yet in which direction the negotiations will go and how countries will implement this, because law has a lot of stimulus but very few really mandatory aspects. But the idea is on the table, but we need to see.
Yeah, I can append from Belgium. We have the same issue here, that especially for private lands, private forests and farms, there are a lot of data, but they are all under privacy laws. So it's not allowed to report on a GPS coordinate level because it has some implications also. It yeah, it's very much also related to how much a certain plot of land is worth, and ownership rights are quite stern here in Belgium. So it's a very delicate subject, this open data thing. I don't know how it went, but I know from the soil security people that they tried to incentivize, indeed, like if we can share your data on an acceptable level, then you will get free access to analysis and something, so that you could say, okay, if you want to keep it private, fine, but then you do your own monitoring. If you want to share, you get a financial incentive for that, and some of course some good laws, hopefully, to protect people's identity and so on. But yeah, that's a bit the case. It's a difficult subject because for forest carbon monitoring, for instance, we're trying a few rapid techniques, a few spectroscopic techniques. But the problem is we can only use generic samples. We don't know where the sample is coming from because the soil service of Belgium that's collecting them from the farmers is not allowed to share the location with us. So there could be a lot of nice AI things where we already, what we know from that site, we can use it to make better predictions, but that's blocked by this open data problem, indeed.
I'm not saying, sorry, I'm not arguing. Oh God.
Oh, sorry.
I'm not arguing against publishing results, but there are some heavy challenges
Mm-hmm.
because monitoring is not designed to yield results on a site-specific level, actually. The systematic errors in monitoring or the sampling requirements to take unbiased samples for reliable trend detection are usually not fulfilled in monitoring. They are designed to come up with some average values for larger entities. So the interesting thing in the soil law at the moment is the discussion about so-called soil units, that you break down the districts into homogeneous units, and then as then a landowner can detect whether the local condition that he sees fit into a certain soil unit, and then all the samplings that are taken for a certain soil units give then an average result, and he can see. That does not mean that when he actually measures at his side, he has deviations, no? And so it's tough thing, especially forest soils. They have such a variability through this mixture of coarse and fine humus and fine and coarse woody debris and plants, and it's really difficult to detect trend or to have a reliable spatially explicit estimate that you can build on then also for future monitoring. So there is something that a user of data always need to be aware of what the restrictions are. That is sometimes difficult to convey.
Thank you also for the kind of further elaboration, and thank you, Jerry, for your question. We have two more questions actually from the chat, and one refers to agroforestry. And the question is, to what extent agroforestry can help in soil to improve soil health when it comes to agricultural land?
Okay, well, I have a few examples. We're doing some agroforestry in the tropics, all for it. Well, not always, but there are some really good practices. It's not easy, but there it makes sense. It depends, I think, in Europe. It can be beneficial as long as you still have quite an important yield, because if you would there's an industrial level of intensification that's not healthy. So I'm not talking about that type of farming, but if you would say, like, if you can, you have to get the highest production that you can do sustainably, because then you have more land to spare for forests, for other things. That's also not always the case, but the idea that agroforestry can be good, but production should always be also an important function of land that is considered arable or considered farming land. So that's something to take into account, because a forest or a grassland can be much better at having a good soil than an arable field. So maybe it's better to reduce the aerial fields a bit, but optimize production and then get more land in a healthy state somewhere else, as long as it doesn't go below a certain threshold. So it is possible, but you always have to consider not taking too much land to get the same yield or to get a good yield.
Thank you, Karen. After these quite specific questions, we now have a more general question that also links to a question that I wanted to ask. What would be the best way to start restoring soil health, actually, particularly in areas where a lot of damage was done? And I know you started elaborating on that, Karen, like starting with the kind of the biggest damage and the biggest problem, but maybe you can elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah. So the first thing I would do if I had to restore a degraded site, or what we do in project, is first indeed get to know the system. Get to know, because there's so many restoration efforts also in the troppings going wrong because people don't understand what's going on. For in the example of dryland salinization, people start adding organic inputs that will reduce topsoil salinity. But if this water table hits the surface, it's game over. So it's not really a good thing to do. So the first thing is to understand, to look at the maps, to look at the information that is there, to understand what you're looking at, to maybe do a little augering, look a little bit into the soil, so understand what you're dealing with. The next step, indeed, what I'm doing and what's the trick of the good pedologist, is to find the biggest problem. If your soil is degraded, why? Is it a nutrient problem? Is it eroding? Is it maybe very shallow? So what is the problem? What is causing your soil to function poorly? And this can be a variety of things, but it's a little bit like going to the doctor. If we're using the health charm, you would never go to the doctor and he would just prescribe you something without taking your heart rate or your blood pressure or whatever. So first you have to know what is the problem with your health, and then you can take the medicine. That's a little bit what I would also suggest them for soil, like find out why this soil is not feeling very well. That would be then the third step after knowing your area, but also what you want to do with it, like what trees would be good for that, what do they need. And then you can also, in a last step, maybe identify the places where this restoration would be most efficient. But the diagnostics in the beginning, I think, are quite important. And it's a little bit like with lawyers. It's best to get the soil scientist in at the beginning, because I get now my inbox is full of people. It's really a thing here now to make orchards, which are normally really good for soil health, or also these food forests and everything. But people just start planting trees without looking at it. And then maybe they put the wrong species, or it's a very compacted thing. And somebody told them to put compost on a very compacted soil. It will be a disaster. So things like this. And then they come to me, and then they already have spent like 10,000 euros trying to make this orchard. It would be a lot easier if we did it right from the start. So in that sense, I think it's good to think a little bit, try to find the right buttons to push first, and then go into the field or into the restoration with a well-balanced plan from all aspects, not just the soil, probably also the trees and the vegetation and what you want to achieve at that place.
Yeah, to basically look at the entire ecosystem and not just certain elements of it, right? Rainer, do you have a complementary comment, or should we continue with the next question?
I look out of the window and I have a Quercus carbinus forest. It's between 200 and 400 meters. They made a clear cut of the lower part and planted monospecies red oak. In the upper part, it was partially wind damaged, and they clear cutted the rest and they planted with the acacia. So, what is the impact on soil? What's the impact on this ecosystem? It's a total catastrophe. And so that's what you see all over the place. And but I would not be able to tell you exactly what the soil degradation is, because the erosion damage is limited to the skidding trails. They were driving over the winter. There is hardly any frost here. You can imagine how the skidding trail looks like. It was like an urban construction place, no? And so I don't have the means to say to which extent soils are degraded, but the ecosystem is completely destroyed, no?
I think that's a very good point. The soil is part of the ecosystem. That's the big thing we always seem to forget. It's just the bottom half. And if the top is in bad condition, so is the below, and vice versa. So I think you're absolutely right. These clear cuts are very bad also for structure. If you say there are a lot of skid marks, that can be really, really, really hard to recover from. So there are many things. Also, all these trees, they may also have a lot of symbiosis in the soil. So anything that removes the cover, the forest floor will be quite badly damaged by the increase in temperature or is in insulation. So I totally agree. That's something we should try to avoid. It's not really also something I wanted to relate to while hearing you talk, is that in Flanders anyway, there's this idea that you can move a forest. So a forest is there, we want a highway in this place, so we cut the forest and we put it somewhere else. That's the solution that some of our politicians find totally acceptable. But especially also from the soil perspective, it takes hundreds of years to build these relations and everything. You can move a tree, but you cannot move or you can replant a tree, but you cannot move a forest. And it's the whole ecosystem that is a forest. It's not just one tree or a group of trees, I would say. So in the end, it would be good to look at it as part of the ecological system or of the ecosystem, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And that's actually something that we're doing in Superb, where we have quite some soil science and monitoring in the 12 demos. And we look at the ecosystem from a holistic point of view, and also try to adapt the forest or restore the forest in an adaptive way to also considering climate change. So I think this is the kind of overall approach, but it is quite often that also when we talk to forest practitioners, that they basically look at what is above ground and not what is below ground. So still quite some capacity building needed here. We will soon come to an end, but I have a final question that is also related to the what you said, salinization. Karen, you mentioned that before. And the question is that in the soil health law proposal, there's the first descriptor, which is salinization, and our participant means that this seems to, or he expects it to be measured at all forest sampling points across Europe, and in his opinion or her opinion, this sounds like a waste of time and money. What is your opinion on that? Like a little bit of a provocative question. The end is very nice.
But I agree. It's a waste of money in many places where we know salinization is not a problem. So I think we could also, I'm not sure, I think from a legislative point of view, this is a whole different thing, because some criteria for some people, other criteria for some, I can imagine that's a legal nightmare. But we know from many soil types that you have too much water, or you have like a downwards elevation anyway. So there is, and a lot of places there's no risk for salinization. So an aspect I didn't get, it's also not in the soil security context, but in degradation, there's also a lot of risk mapping involved that you could do. And I think they were made like soil erosion risk maps, at least they were made for Flanders, but they're based on modeling. So I agree with Reiner that there should be more models are always wrong, but they can give you an idea of where to look. So that's indeed still a point for monitoring, but it can reduce costs because monitoring can be extremely expensive. To have these risk maps to say, okay, where is salinization expected to be a problem? It's always in the drier parts. It's where irrigation is taking place. It's near coastlines or in places where they use a lot of thaw salt next to roads. But yeah, that's hopefully not too bad. So that's one element that you could, that is he or she or they have a problem, have a point. It could be a gigantic waste of money to do that everywhere. From a scientific point of view, I must say.
May I ask also two final questions, Gesche?
Of course.
Yeah,
of course.
the first is if you're now in large parts of Central Europe or Northern Central Europe, if you, for example, go through areas like the Harz Mountains, I think you get the impression that we're entering the age of forest disturbance with hundreds of disturbed areas. And for me, would be a question, if you look from the perspective as a soil scientist, so what would this mean if we have an increase by perhaps doubling or even more, a higher increase of disturbed area? And the other point is perhaps especially to you, Rainer, looking on the challenges with the adoption of the nature restoration law, do you think that soil health or soil monitoring law will really get into practice if you think about more or less the political development also on the European level?
So the last question maybe first. The European Parliament, they have agreed on their version, and the European Council meets in June. We have some optimism, and I think it's a well-designed lawmaking. Okay, it's a directive, it's not a regulation. It needs to be implemented in national legislation, needs to be followed up by national implementations in their national legislative frameworks. So from that point of view, I'm very optimistic. From the first question, there seems to be a chance in these massive perturbations that the European forests are confronted with through pests, through fires, through wind. It's really massive. It's really tough for forest owners. It's not an easy solution. I mean, from a purely ecological point of view, it depends on what you then do with the soil. When you go to the Harz Mountains and you see that they reforest this thing with Norway spruce, then you think, okay, on which planet are these guys are living? No? So they don't use an opportunity apparently that they may have. And I don't also have the feeling that at many sites, the local regenerative potential that is actually existing is not utilized sufficiently because there is some kind of target species that needs to be reestablished. So this opportunity that you're describing may not be utilized everywhere possible. From a soil point of view, a higher proportion of soils where the natural vegetation can get reestablished in a natural equilibrium of dead organic matter that is decomposed with a decomposer system that is in a biosynosis that is site adapted between species and soil conditions and climate. And that is the ideal case. No? But we, on the other hand, we cannot take area out of management. So there needs to be a management approach. And how can this management approach be sustainably, ecologically sustainable, so that a largely unknown ecological system is promoted, and then this law now makes the right approach. We need to improve our knowledge at local specific, ideally, and then we can grow into improved restoration approaches.
Does this answer your question, Andreas?
Yes. Sorry, I was muted.
Okay, perfect. So then I suggest, if there are no further questions from the audience, that we wrap it up. Thank you very much for your inputs. A lot of participants actually stayed during the entire webinar, so I think this is very nice. I'm happy to announce the next webinar. We had to make some changes actually, but now it looks like the topic has been decided upon, and we will of course inform you about the speakers in due time. It will happen on 14th of June, and no, on the 12th of June. Sorry. On the 12th of June, and we will look into what to learn from forest biodiversity modeling for forest restoration. So also an interesting element of the ecosystem to look into the biodiversity, and we have some modeling experts in Superb, but of course also beyond Superb. So we have a couple of speakers, yeah, stay tuned for more information. Have a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much to our great presenters today. Thank you very much for moderating with me again, Andreas, and I wish all of you a nice rest of the day. And for those who listen to this webinar afterwards, nice rest of the morning or afternoon or whenever you're watching it. So yeah, we'll follow up in June. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
guys. Thank you.
Thanks.